Hello, everybody. I'm Brian Heisenbuttle,
And I'm Mike Carlson.
and welcome to the View from the U.
Brian, big week of college football, a lot of big championship games with huge BCS implications, a couple earth-shattering games in terms of the BCS picture. So why don't you get us started with a couple of headlines?
All right, Mike, I'm so sorry. Your NIU Huskies just couldn't get it done, lost to Bowling Green in the MAC championship, and they still got a great bowl, still a top 25 ranked team. It was just unfortunate they couldn't get it done.
Yeah, and you know what? You really hate to see it end on the final game of the season. You'd much, I guess, rather have that bandage ripped off very quickly and have it end at one of the first couple games of the season. But this is an NIU team. They're very good. They're going to be down Jordan Lynch next year, so I really don't expect to see him anywhere in the top 25 next year, Brian.
Yeah. So, of course, moving on with headlines, SEC champions, my Auburn Tigers, making a trip to the national championship. And, Mike, I'm just so impressed with these guys. One guy I'm so impressed with is Nick Marshall because he's really grown as a quarterback. He really wasn't in the primetime discussion earlier in the season. And granted, a lot of their team's success is based on that defensive front and also Trey Mason. But this guy has stepped out. He's such an athletic quarterback. He's such a fun guy to watch.
Yeah, he really is. And, we've talked about it every week. I've always said, Brian, that if Auburn wants a shot at winning any kind of huge college football game, it starts with Nick Marshall, and he's shown up every time I've kind of challenged him against Alabama. I said Nick Marshall's gonna be the deal breaker, and he showed up against Auburn, against Mizzou. I mean, you have Trey Mason, and that's great, but you need to have some kind of passing game, and Marshall showed up, and he's getting better as each game goes by. So right now, Brian, if I'm Florida State, I don't know what to expect from Nick Marshall because he's got better every game.
Yeah. So Mike, one thing I have to talk about, great for your Baylor Bears, is Bedlam. Massive upset. Oklahoma taking down Oklahoma State in Stillwater. Mike, just tell us what happened there.
Brian, I was astonished because I saw this. This is an Oklahoma team. It's a down year for them. They're a shell of the Sam Bradford years, where they were a powerhouse every year. But this year, they weren't. Like I said, they weren't great. And this is an Oklahoma State team, Brian. They're going to put up a ton of points. And I'm expecting, Oklahoma's going to get blown out. OK State's just going to march right into a BCS bowl, no problemo. Not the case. Clint Shelf, the senior quarterback, didn't play as well as he did against Baylor. And, that's been kind of the thing for Oklahoma State this year. It's been their quarterback situation. When they've had a quarterback, they've played great. Yeah, you're going to beat the Baylors of the world when you have a great quarterback and that kind of an offense. But, that wasn't the case. And, Baylor, I'm really psyched to see these guys in a bowl game, in a BCS bowl game, actually.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you looked especially with the Baylor game and Texas Tech. Oklahoma State usually picks up huge points because they get momentum and they score just drive after drive. I mean, we're looking at a situation where they couldn't even put up 30 points on this Oklahoma team who the rankings have shown and really how they've played has shown that they are better than what this Oklahoma team is right now.
Yeah, for sure. And, Brian, you're going to love this. War Eagle, Gus Malzahn, Coach of the Year,
Yeah.
Give us a little information on that.
All right, well, you won the Home Depot Coach of the Year award, and I just think it's fantastic, especially since just what happened with Gene Chizik's team last year. Now, I did always like this guy. He was the offensive coordinator when Chizik was in power. He made all the play calls for the Cam Newton era, and he really just did wonders with the keys to the kingdom in his hand. I mean, granted, there are a lot of coaches, like, of course, you have Florida State and all those other great programs who may have better records, but if you look at overall turnaround with an Auburn team that doesn't, I mean, they have Nick Marshall and Trey Mason, but they don't have, like Jameis Winston or, Manti Te'o,
Yeah.
huge, massive standout players that on their own can lift a team to great ranks. So that's why I'm just in love with Gus Malzahn this year, and I think it's so great that he won this award, and he really does deserve it because he built a well-rounded team out of an Auburn team that went 0-8 in conference last year, and it really has shown thanks to and it's rewarded with a trip to the national championship.
Yeah, and Brian, you bring up a great point. Gene Chizik, it's pretty easy to coach when you got such a superior athlete on your team as Cam Newton. And you know what? He showed that he lost those pieces. He lost the Cam Newtons, the Michael Dyers of the world. And his team kind of fell apart. And I think you got to give Gus Malzahn a lot of credit. You don't have a superior quarterback in Nick Marshall. We've all acknowledged that. He's no Jameis Winston, Johnny Manziel. He's not one of those premier SEC quarterbacks that you're used to seeing. You have Trey Mason. He's a great running back, but you can only do so much with the ground game. It's easier to have a good quarterback and succeed than it is to have a good running back because, you look at teams like the Minnesota Vikings, who are very one-dimensional in their game. Defenses have a certain advantage over that. And you know what? I think he had an okay offensive line, defensive line, and defensive backfields and wide receivers. but he didn't have anything exceptional except for Trey Mason. And I think, doing the best with what he had, you got to give him credit, Brian. I mean, this is a guy who's taken essentially what was a program of nothing last year and turned it into something great.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at it, especially with proven against Alabama, the in-state rival, because Alabama's always one of those teams that have the big quarterback, McElroy, McCarron, and Auburn really hasn't had that, and except for of course 2010 where they won it with Cam Newton, but other than that, they just were humiliated the last 2 years. And while Nick Marshall he's very fast, he's a very good athlete, sort of like Cam Newton. He's not really the Superman that we saw back in 2010, but they're still finding a way to win with him, and he's really making these players stand out. So, Mike, our next headline?
You know what, Brian? Our next headline, I want to take a look at the upset. You're going to touch on this actually next here in a second. Michigan State upsetting Ohio State. I think, Brian, we all thought about it in the back of our heads, but we kind of, pushed it off like Michigan State is, they're not going to stand a chance. Ohio State's going to waltz in the national championship game. But there were a lot of question marks with this Ohio State team. And, that's going to open the way, of course, for a great BCS matchup between Florida State and Auburn.
Yeah, and it's really something that you have to appreciate this Michigan State team. We saw their jump from, I think, 11 all the way down to number 4, and now they're ranked higher than Stanford going into the Rose Bowl. And I really do think this team deserves it. I mean, I'll touch on this later, of course. But, yeah, this team has been, completely undervalued. I mean, they were ranked 23 halfway through the season when they had a resounding win over Michigan. And I really do think that was really the sweetest win that these guys got the credit that they deserved, especially since there's so many question marks really in their offense, because everyone knew how good Michigan State's defense was.
Yeah, and then, Brown, I got one more headline for you. We're not going to speculate too much, but Mac Brown, we're hearing a lot of reports. This guy's a great coach, Brian, but, he might be on his way out at UT.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to just talk about all these rumors and everything, because, of course, we have no more of an inside track than you do on this, and of course, Nick Saban, the whole Nick Saban Texas thing is getting into it. You just don't want to see the coaches of these programs, like these big programs in Alabama and Texas, getting into all these problems. And talking coaching, Mike, Ed Orgeron, so sad. He did a great thing this year, but he could not get it done against UCLA, and now it's really come to hit him hard.
Yeah, you know what, Brian, Sarkisian, he's a great coach. Give him all his credit in the due. Steve Sarkisian is beyond all words. He's a great coach. He's done a lot of great things at Washington. But I just liked Coach O. I'm just going to call him because I cannot pronounce his last name. I just loved him a lot more, than I like Sarkisian. I think he's a guy who connects with the players well, and I think that's what you need. Oregon might not be the guy in recruiting, and of course that's a big deal. I mean, you'd rather go play for a sexy pick like a Nick Saban or a Chip Kelly back when he was playing, or a Les Miles. That's kind of the popular pick of coach. But this guy gets the job done, Brian. He connects with the players. He motivates his players. And I think when you go to bed at night, that's what you want to do. It's not the recruiting that is going to make your team better. It'll make your team marginally better, but it's how you use that recruiting and how you connect with those players.
Yeah, and I think what we'll be able to see is that, of course, Orgeron's probably going to get a job somewhere, if not with a major conference school, maybe like a Mountain West or a MAC school. And I do think he's on the path to sort of keep working his way up until he consistently gets the keys to a big program in his hands.
Yeah, I definitely think so. But, best wishes to Steve Sarkisian. I think he's going to be a great coach down at USC. In my opinion, I thought Coach O was the better candidate.
Yeah. So, speaking of USC in the Pac-12 championship, my Stanford Cardinal getting it done in Tempe. Tell us what happened, man.
Brian, I was shocked when I saw this final score. You look at Tempe, and that's a hostile environment. And, Taylor Kelly plays great in Tempe, so everything you're looking at it is going against Stanford in this game, and that was really what shocked me. I was expecting, I was expecting a win out of ASU, but I wasn't expecting Stanford to blow out Arizona State by any stretch of the imagination. Stanford played well. Kevin Hogan, he played decent, only threw for 1 touchdown. But, the key, Brian, for this team is Tyler Gaffney. Stanford revolves around Tyler Gaffney. I think this guy, he's the key to the offense. And, he's kind of a Percy Harvin we saw back at Florida. I've kind of compared him to that in the past. He's like a Percy Harvin in that, he returns kicks, he runs, he catches the ball. He'll pass the ball occasionally on a halfback pass, on a halfback pass. He's just a superior athlete. And, I was disappointed in how, Taylor Kelly played. I mean, you expect a guy who plays well at home to, play well at home and continue that average. And if you looked at the splits, Kelly plays, so much better at home than he does away. And you would just not expect for him to have a clunker. And such a big at such a big moment, I guess, because you play at home, you're comfy, everything's there. You've played at home, you played well at home in the past, but Brian, he could not get it together. It was a sad thing to see. This is an Arizona State team that's going to have to regroup for next year. But all the props in the world to Stanford. They've had a tough year. They haven't lived up to those BCS championship predictions that Coach Corso gave to them in the beginning of the year. But a Rose Bowl isn't bad. If you go to Oregon, it might be bad. But they're not going to be in the Rose Bowl right now. So, all the kudos in the world to Stanford. I think they got a great matchup against Michigan State. And Kevin Hogan, he had a tough one against ASU. He's got an even tougher one, coming up against Michigan State. So now I'll bring you back in here, Brian.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because Stanford and Michigan State, it's going to be such a good matchup. Because if you look at the quarterbacks, you have Cooks, and then you have Hogan. Sorry, I forgot his name there for a second. But, those are very equal. These defenses keep bailing their teams out time and time again. They're about equal. The only place where Stanford really has the advantage is that they do have that Tyler Gaffney character. But that still may not be like a determining factor in this game because Michigan State, of course, still has a run game.
Yeah, and the key is going to be Tyler Gaffney. If Tyler Gaffney gets the ball and it can be effective against a very, very tough Michigan State defense. You look at Ohio State, you got Braxton Miller and you got Carlos Hyde, and you can argue that those are two of the most dynamic guys in the Big Ten right now. They're both superior athletes, and then, of course, you got Kenny Guyton on the sidelines. He's a great quarterback. And the fact that Michigan State was able to shut down Ohio State and shut down guys who are those good of athletes, it's going to be interesting for Stanford, and I think it's going to start with Gaffney. If you can get that guy the ball early and often, and if he can find the holes against this tough Michigan State defense, I think Stanford has a pretty good shot of winning the Rose Bowl.
Yeah, and also Michigan State can open up those holes for Jeremy Langford. He's sort of gone unnoticed, but he's really a great running back. He's a guy you don't notice, but he consistently puts up over 100 yards and a few touchdowns week after week after week. And I do think it ties back into Michigan State not really getting the credit that they deserve and the whole BCS situation that they really do deserve now getting in the Rose Bowl.
Yeah, and I definitely think they're underrated, Michigan State. Just one more thing to touch on is I was surprised, Brian, when I saw that they were going to be playing Ohio State in the Big Ten championship. But when I saw it, and I've looked a little bit at their defense, it kind of clicked. I'm thinking, oh, this is a Michigan State team that's very good. They're very underrated because you got, of course, your Michigans, your Ohio States, you have your Wisconsin, you have all those huge programs, your Nebraskas, and you just kind of have Michigan State doing their thing off to the side, steady, equal. They've just kind of been like that the whole year. And, I think Michigan State and Stanford, you couldn't ask for a better matchup, Brian.
Yeah, and it's interesting how almost people were more talking about how Iowa's sort of getting back to almost being at the top of the division rather than, Mark D'Antonio just bringing his team up to a one-loss team that's BCS ranked and really got it done against the big-time opponents. So, we said before, they've credit where credit's due. These guys have earned their spot, and I really do think that if they beat Stanford, they'll be serious contenders, especially for next year and years to come.
Yeah, so I'm going to turn it over for your call on your game, Brian. Take it away.
All right, so yeah, Big Ten championship with huge BCS implications. Mike, I was so excited to see this game. I was really excited how it turned out. Given the teams I like in the Big Ten, this wasn't my favorite matchup. I'm not really big a fan of either of those teams, but if it could get Auburn into the BCS National Championship, I'm all for Michigan State. So the first thing I want to talk about in this game is the momentum, Mike. The momentum in this game was probably unparalleled to any game I've ever seen because, you start the first couple minutes, Michigan State gets some touchdown, you think, oh, Ohio State's done for. Then Ohio State completely comes back, scores 24 unanswered points, take the lead, and you're like, wow, Michigan State completely blew it. And then Michigan State again comes back to score 17 points unanswered and win the game. So, Mike, I'd like to just dial it back a bit to last week because we talked about Michigan versus Ohio State, how Ohio State showed weakness. Now, Urban Meyer before the game said he was going to make some defensive changes to get things to click a bit better, and boy, did they work. I was so impressed with how well this Ohio State team played defensively. Michigan State doesn't have the most dynamic or the best offense in the Big Ten, but, they have been playing pretty well. They put up a big number against Nebraska, and they were, for the most part, shut down for a big majority of the game by this Ohio State defense. But, Ohio State, they were hanging with them, but they failed to prove that they can beat a great team. That's one of the problems I had with this Ohio State team that I've talked about throughout the year. their really only big one is against Wisconsin. I mean, they had the close win against Northwestern, but we saw later in the season that they're not a very good team, and it proves they almost lost to like Maine and some other teams. But I mean, that's just how it happens. But I mean, Ohio State, they had so many offensive problems. I mean, Michigan State's defense is really good, and they did a pretty good job shutting down Braxton Miller more or less. But Ohio State, 1 for 10 on third down, 0 for 2 on fourth down. And Mike, if you're in line for a national championship, you have got to put up better numbers than that. And if you're not around 500 or above it, you're going to have a lot of trouble against big-name defenses. I mean, Michigan State's a big-name defense, of course, but when you have, Florida State, who has a great defense, and then can also kill you on the opposite side of the ball with Jameis Winston, it's just not gonna work. So one of the things that Michigan State did well is they made Braxton Miller pass, and he was awful. I mean, props to him. He's a great football player, but he got it done with his legs throughout the season, and now they needed to get it done with his arm. Michigan State had him right where they wanted him. He just could not produce the offense that Ohio State feeds on and keeps winning games that got him this win streak. But I mean, the Ohio State run game, of course, Braxton Miller, Carlos Hyde, the two big names, they got 300 rushing yards against Michigan State. Now, this is a team that allows way less than 100 yards per game as an average. So I thought, Ohio State's better. They won't get more than 150, 200. These guys really blew them open for most of the game, and that's really the reason why they had their 24 unanswered point streak. But, I mean, Michigan State, they sort of had a better overall offense. Connor Cook, he went from 100 average pass yards per game to 300 this game. And if you want to talk about big players stepping up, this guy stepped up exactly when it mattered, Mike. There is really nothing other than that to say for this guy, because he was one of those guys who sort of been underneath that whole defensive gauntlet that they have at Michigan State and hasn't really gotten the press. But he really deserved it this game because he showed up and threw the ball well when he really didn't need to do that earlier in the season. So my last thing I want to talk about is Mike D'Antonio. Michigan's first 12-win season in school history, Big Ten championship, going to the Rose Bowl for the first time in a while. And I just have to say hats off to this guy. This guy's really built a really good, really well-rounded team this year that really needs to be feared. I mean, I'm not going to say the word underrated again, or they didn't get their spot in the BCS, because I think we've said it enough. But, I mean, honestly, I'm just so glad that this team turned out this way and was able to beat a big-time opponent like Ohio State. And they really were the better team than Ohio State. They're way more well-rounded. Ohio State's defense did step up when I really didn't think much of them at all. But Michigan State's a way more well-rounded team. Their offense may not be as good, but their defense really gets it done for them. And it's going to be interesting because they're playing Stanford in the Rose Bowl, of course, where neither team has a really dynamic offense, but both teams have a really great defense. So, Mike, we could be looking at a game with a score of, 3-0, 3-2? Maybe one on a safety?
Brian, I think with both of these teams matching up, I think you could see a score like 3-0. I mean, both of these defenses, you look at Scove for Stanford. We love Shane Scove on this show, and I think you look at Michigan State. They're just so strong as a unit. Brian, the quarterbacks might not even need to show up for this game. You might just want to bring the defenses out there because that's where it's going to happen right there.
Yeah. We're looking at big plays probably like kick returns, fumble recovery, scoop and score, pick six. All things like that. So, it sure won't be no SEC championship.
It's not going to be an SEC championship game. I would definitely, if you're a gambling person and a viewer of this show, I would pick the under. Because right now Michigan State and Stanford are on a collision course for a defensive battle. And I think that's really refreshing to see, Brian, in college football. The days of, putting 60, 70, and an era where you put up 60, 70 points, on another team and totally blow them out, or when you have games that like the SEC championship game that ended with some outrageous number like 52-42. So I think that it'll be cool to see a good defensive battle, and it's the granddaddy of them all, Brian. So what a better stage.
Yeah, and Mike, let's just take a minute to talk about the Bulls, because the Bulls have been out. Let's start it off with the big daddy of them all. We already sort of talked about this a little bit. We should talk about it a bit more. Auburn versus Florida State. And Mike, what do you think of this game? I think it's going to be a great
matchup. I think it's going to be a battle, and I think it's going to start with Nick Marshall. I've said it. I feel like a broken record at this point, Brian. I've said it so many weeks in a row. But Nick Marshall's got to get better. He's been great. He's been amazing these last couple weeks. I mean, downing Alabama and then downing Mizzou. I mean, you have to be a great quarterback to do that. But he's got to play his very best against Jameis Winston. He has to go toe-to-toe with this guy because Florida State has all the weapons that Auburn has and more. I mean, they have the run game. They have an exceptional pass game. And the Auburn DBs, Brian, Florida State has some huge receivers. A couple of them have been drawing comparisons to Megatron out in the NFL, Mr. Calvin Johnson. So if I'm an Auburn DB right now, I'm studying all the game film I have because these guys have a clear physical advantage on your defensive backfield.
Yeah, and one thing I really want to talk about is the Auburn defensive front hasn't really gotten too much credit because it's all sort of been on that offense and that great dynamic offense that Gus Malzahn has. But if you really look at it, I mean, you got Dee Ford, you got a bunch of guys who are really able to stop T.J. Yeldon against Alabama. And with a quarterback like Jameis Winston and the whole run game they have at Florida State, they need to get into the backfield and they need to get into their offense. I mean, see if you can expose the fact that Jameis Winston is a freshman. He's still prone to make mistakes. See if you can get him to make a bad throw an interception. But I think that Auburn has a really good chance of challenging that because the only other opponent that they've really played that sort of matches up to that level is Clemson, who of course couldn't get it done as we saw. And I don't really have too high opinion of Clemson anymore. It's because they couldn't really win the big games. But putting that aside, if Jameis Winston can't throw it comfortably and that produces problems with how well he throws, I think that it'll be a huge advantage to this Auburn defense.
Yeah, Brian, and right now I'm going to take my pick on this game. I'm going to pick Florida State to win this one just because, I've been a huge Florida State fan, an avid supporter this year, and I know probably much to your dismay that I'm picking Florida State here, kind of going against you. But, I think this is a Florida State team that just has all the plus weapons. Auburn's going to put up a fight. It will definitely, not be shades of the Notre Dame massacre that we saw last year. But it'll be a close game, and it's going to come down to, who gets the ball last, I think.
Yeah, well, it's definitely going to be an offensive battle, and I agree. I'm not sure I'm going to pick Florida State. I do have to go with my Auburn boys just because I think that later in the game, Auburn may be able to figure out how to, isolate and sort of get rid of this Florida State passing offense. And I do think, as far as being well-rounded, while Auburn doesn't really have the passing capability that Jameis Winston has, they have been able to run the ball even when people know they're going to run the ball, sort of like how Stanford does it with the program they have there. But I think that it'll be tougher for Florida State to isolate and stop one element of Auburn's game than it will be for Auburn to stop the Jameis Winston passing attack. And that's just a prediction from me. I think that Auburn will get a slight advantage. Again, I do believe it'll be an offensive battle, come down to the last person who has the ball. But yeah, it should be a great game. So let's move on to our next bowl.
Brian, I really want to take a look at this one. UCF and Baylor. Now you might look at UCF and you're going to scoff a little bit. You're like, UCF, these guys, they're not a major conference team. They're not even in the SEC, ACC, Big Ten, Pac-12. All the big divisions with the numbers after them. I can't name them all. But this is a UCF team, Brian. I was very surprised by their play. And you know what? I kind of found one of my own quarterbacks who I like here, another one of my favorites. And it's Blake Bortles down at UCF. I think this guy, Brian, right now scouts are raving about him. Mel Kiper has him. He's rocketed up his draft board this year. He's starting to emerge as a guy who could dethrone Teddy Bridgewater or Johnny Manziel as that top quarterback prospect. And I think it starts, if UCF wants to win this game, it's going to start with Bortles. I mean, he's played great this year, Brian. He draws comparisons to the great Brett Favre. And, granted, Brett Favre never had the prettiest stats. He owns the record for the most touchdowns and the most interceptions thrown in your career. So, but Bortles is he's a gunslinger, Brian, and he's completed over 60% of his passes in every game this year. So I think if you're Baylor, you do not want to get caught napping because Bortles and company they can make this a BCS nightmare for them.
Yeah, and I don't think that it'll be a massacre. Like, of course, we have Northern Illinois versus Florida State, which was awful, but of course, Florida State was just such a great team last year, even without Jameis. But if you really look at it, if you look at the beginning of UCF's schedule, they had Penn State and South Carolina. They beat Penn State, sort of hung in with and lost to South Carolina. So it's not going to be a blowout, but I just feel like this Baylor Bears team, they've really bounced back. They had a good win against Texas. I was afraid they would sort of have that Oklahoma State hangover, after losing to Oklahoma State and then almost losing to TCU. But I don't know. I'm not sold on them, especially against Bryce Petty and just how dynamic him and his receivers have been this year.
Yeah, and on the note of Bryce Petty, an interesting thing, he decided not to opt to go to the draft, Brian, which was a move that surprised me. You would kind of figure that you want to end on the highest note that you can. But I think that, Bryce Petty, by coming back, he's kind of making that statement like, we got more work to do. And, we're going to be a threat next year. So that definitely factors in. If you're Petty, if you see this as your last game, which he doesn't now, but if you were to see it, you kind of want to press a little bit. You want to have a great last game. But, he can relax. He's like, you know what, I got another year of this. I'm going to have another year in the offense. So I think the stock for both of these quarterbacks is on the rise. But you know what, if you want to watch the game, and if you think this is going to be a blowout, get that out of your head. And if you want to watch a good quarterback, watch Blake Bortles. This guy, he's very underrated, but, he could potentially be the quarterback for your NFL team.
Yeah, like switching one BCS bowl I think is going to be interesting is the Orange Bowl, which is Clemson versus Ohio State. This is a really interesting matchup because I see both of these teams. I see teams that, they walked over everyone along their way, but they couldn't win the big game. Ohio State couldn't get it done against Michigan State, and Clemson couldn't get it done against Florida State. So, Mike, what are your thoughts on this?
You know what, Brian? You bring up a great point. Both of these teams, they had a shot. They had that moment to seize that one spot, that two spot, but they couldn't do it. Ohio State was on the cusp of it. They'd hung in all year. They'd hung in all of last year, actually, and they couldn't do it. But I think I like Clemson in this game, Brian, and my main reason for liking Clemson is Sammy Watkins, the wide receiver at Clemson. This guy, Brian, he's going to be a great NFL wide receiver. I'm positive he's the number one wide receiving prospect. And, if you're Braxton Miller, you got Carlos Hyde, but you really can't name anyone after that. And I think it helps to have a wide receiver to throw to if you're a quarterback rather than a running back to hand it off to. So I think right now Clemson has the definite edge in this game.
Yeah, especially since, of course, Clemson's big loss being Florida State against a quarterback who's just such a dynamic passer. It's just going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting to watch because I do think that Clemson does have the offensive advantage because Ohio State's defense, I think, is a bit more vulnerable to the pass than the run, especially since, Sammy Watkins is such a big play guy, and we saw in the Big Ten Championship Ohio State's defense had been giving up those big plays to Michigan State.
Yeah, and I think if you're Urban Meyer, you got a game plan around Sammy Watkins because, Boyd's a great quarterback, but when you give him a Sammy Watkins to throw to, in tight coverage, Sammy's he's gonna do it every time. And, this guy's a big wide receiver. He's a physical wide receiver. And, those DBs, they're going to have their work cut out for him at Ohio State, Brian.
Yeah, so, Mike, there's one more I wanted to talk about. It's not a BCS bowl, but I think it's going to be so fun to watch. It is Wisconsin versus South Carolina. And, Mike, these are two teams that when you look at them, South Carolina isn't really the best. They weren't going to go to the SEC Championship. Wisconsin was sort of second place to Ohio State. They weren't going to go to the Big Ten Championship. But these are two guys that I think are really underrated and deserve a lot more credit. And it's going to be interesting to see them play.
And, of course, they're two squads, Brian, that, grossly underperformed this year. And you look at Jadeveon Clowney, his stock, you might argue, has fallen a little bit, after last year's huge hype fest, surrounding this guy who was supposed to be the next great defensive end. So there's a lot of question marks there. But I really, really like this Wisconsin team, Brian. Dynamic running attack. A dynamic running attack. You think that when a guy like Monte Ball, one of the greatest college rushers of all time, leaves, you're like, no running game. It's over. We're going to be passing the ball. That's exactly the opposite. Wisconsin has gotten better at the run this year. And, if you're Jadeveon Clowney, this is more than about this is more than about winning a bowl game. It's about getting that one last chance to impress scouts because this year, he's grossly underperformed, Brian.
Yeah, I do agree, especially since Wisconsin, after beating Nebraska, going to the Rose Bowl last year, and then falling short to Stanford, they weren't really known as they weren't really put up there with those big schools. They weren't put up there with the Ohio States, even like the Michigans of the league. They're sort of like a second place team, like you see in Arkansas, or even in Auburn last year. But I do really like this team, and you said it best. It's really one thing to have a guy like Monte Bell go to your school. It's quite another to have him graduate and then have another guy to come in and put his name on the Heisman boards. So I'm just astounded with this Wisconsin team. Mike, let's talk about South Carolina. I wasn't really convinced with them early in the season. I talked about it in an earlier episode, but they got it done against Clemson. So it really does beg the question, dude, what is this team all about?
Brian, Steve Spurrier, a great coach, but it's South Carolina, they're a question mark right now. You have these games against Clemson where you look amazing. You look like you could compete for the SEC championship game. But then you have these clunkers. I mean, they've had so many clunkers throughout the season. They've had games against really bad opponents that should have been won. It's a get in, get out, let's go home kind of a deal. But it's gonna depend, Brian. And I think that if South Carolina comes out terrible, they're gonna lose. They're gonna lose this game by a lot. But if they come out well, they're gonna compete. I think with this Wisconsin team. But it's up in the air at this point. I think there's so many question marks. Spurrier's a great coach. Don't get me wrong. I think he's coached this program well. But for some reason, the players they either come out hot or they come out ice cold.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think really the downhill point for South Carolina is it's unfortunate because it was right at the beginning of the season. It was a game against Georgia because Georgia's coming off a loss against Clemson after thought to be maybe a BCS contender for this year, of course, before all the injuries. And of course, South Carolina couldn't get it done then, and yet they have the win against Clemson. They've really been back and forth, and I do think they've been sort of like an endurance team. I mean, they lost early to a good opponent, but they have won a few of the easy games to keep them in the top 15. But they haven't really stood out. They haven't had a signature win, except, of course, and I'll say it again, Clemson. But and I'm just not sold on this team. So it's just going to be interesting to watch which team steps up.
Yeah, it definitely will. And I think, if you're Wisconsin, you can maybe sleep a little bit easier at night because you don't know what team's going to come out. And it's going to really, if you're looking on the defensive side, it's going to hinge on Jadeveon Clowney. I mean, this guy, he's an amazing pass rusher, Brian, but there's been a lot of controversy surrounding him this year. He wants to sit out some games. He wants to play some games. Doesn't want to play some games. It's all he said, she said type of stuff. But I think if you want to be great on defense, it's going to start with Mr. Clowney up there on the D end.
Yeah. So Mike, next week, of course, no games except for Army Navy. So instead of fighting over the game, we've decided to cap off our season. Of course, before bowl week, we're gonna hold the first View from the U award show. Or what we're gonna do is we're gonna get a bunch of categories and award them to teams, players that we think have earned them. So it's gonna be fun next week, Mike.
Yeah, Brian. Actually, surprisingly, we did not get an invitation to the Heisman ceremony. You would think that the NCAA would maybe watch our show and shoot an invitation our way, but instead we're gonna have our own View from the U awards, and it's gonna be a lot of fun, Brian. I'm gonna be handing out my Heisman winner, and we'll see how it matches up with the previous week's Heisman winner, and a lot of other great awards. It's gonna be a great time.
Yeah, I'll check the Heisman, see if they got it right, because I mean, this is number one on the board right here. So, yeah. So thank you all for watching. We'll catch you next week. It's gonna be a lot of fun. I've been Brian Hasenbottle.
And I'm Mike Carlson.
See you.
See you later, guys.